What would you do if one day you woke up and realized that everything you thought mattered, your wealth, your status, your reputation, suddenly felt meaningless? Have you ever faced a moment when life seemed to collapse around you, leaving only silence, emptiness, and the haunting thought that maybe your best days were already behind you? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you, and perhaps even touch something deep inside your own heart. John Anderson was a man who, on paper, had it all. He lived in a towering penthouse overlooking New York City. His name was tied to successful companies, and his bank account overflowed in ways most of us can't even imagine. The world called him a millionaire, a man of power and influence. But behind the glossy photographs and the carefully crafted image, John was drowning. His business empire had begun to crumble, family members had drifted away, and his nights were filled not with parties and laughter, but with silence so heavy it echoed through the vast, empty rooms of his home. Money can buy many things, but it cannot purchase peace of mind, it cannot heal loneliness, and it cannot fill the void left by broken relationships or lost dreams. John would sit by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, staring out at the city lights below, wondering how he, a man once celebrated, had ended up in a cage of his own making. Have you ever felt that kind of emptiness? The one that no achievement, no possession, no recognition seems capable of curing. In those long nights, John often thought his life was already over, even though he was still alive. It was as if the very soul inside him had shut down. He had worked for decades, chasing goals, chasing recognition, chasing numbers on a screen. But the higher he climbed, the more he discovered that the view at the top was lonelier than he ever imagined. The powerful meetings, the endless negotiations, the rush of closing deals, all of it had lost its taste. The millionaire who once commanded attention in boardrooms now couldn't even command the strength to get out of bed some mornings. What you're about to see is not just the story of wealth and loss. It's about the fragile line between despair and redemption, because John's story takes a turn in a way no one could have predicted. The truth is, sometimes salvation doesn't come from those we consider powerful or wise. Sometimes it comes from the most unexpected places. And in John's case, it came from a child. Yes, a child. Someone who had no money, no authority, no position in society. Someone whose innocence and imagination would do what years of wealth could not. Awaken the forgotten soul of a broken man. Imagine that for a moment. A millionaire who thought his life was finished, being reminded of hope by a voice so small yet so pure. It cut through all the noise of his failures. This is not just John's story. It is also a mirror for all of us, because deep down we know that success without meaning feels empty. Have you ever been there, reached a point where you achieved something you once dreamed of, only to realize it didn't fill the hole inside? If so, you'll understand why John's encounter with the child was more than coincidence. It was destiny. Stay with me, because the moment their paths cross will show how quickly a single spark of innocence can reignite a fire long thought dead. John Anderson's despair was real, his downfall undeniable. But just when he believed the story of his life had already ended, something extraordinary was about to begin. And maybe, as you listen to John's story, a part of you recognizes that same silence, that same weight he carried. Maybe you've also faced moments when life felt heavier than you could handle, when success didn't taste like you thought it would, or when you wondered if there was still something ahead worth dreaming about. If this stirs something inside you, I'd love for you to share it. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Your story, your perspective, even just a feeling. You'd be surprised how many people in this community read those words and realize they're not alone. When you take a second to write a comment, it's more than just a reaction. It's a way of giving life to the conversation, of letting others know that what we're talking about here has meaning. And if this message has touched you in any way, a simple like on this video tells me we're walking the right path together. It's such a small action, but it helps this channel reach more people who might need exactly this reminder today. And of course, if stories like this move you, if you want to keep reflecting on the contrast between wealth and innocence, despair and hope, arrogance and redemption, then subscribing is how you stay with me on this journey. Each new video builds on the last, and your presence here is what makes this space grow into something bigger than just a story on a screen. Because in the end, it's not just John's story. It's about all of us, our struggles, our fears, our rediscoveries. Your engagement, your like, your comment, your decision to subscribe keeps these stories alive, spreading them far beyond what I could ever do alone. And now, let's go back to John. Just when his night seemed endless and hope felt like a stranger he would never meet again, something unexpected happened. John Anderson had built a world that many people would have envied from the outside. His estate in Connecticut stretched across acres of manicured lawns and private gardens. He owned a mansion that seemed more like a palace than a home, filled with Italian marble, chandeliers imported from Paris, and art that once hung in prestigious galleries. There were luxury cars in his garage, sleek machines polished to perfection, reminders of deals closed and power gained. His name carried weight in the financial district of New York, where executives lowered their voices when he entered a room. For years, John equated respect with dominance, believing that control over others meant control over life itself. But the truth behind the curtain told another story. All that grandeur had turned into a gilded cage, one that trapped him in silence he could no longer bear. He would wake up in king-sized beds that felt emptier than a desert, surrounded by possessions that had lost their meaning. The laughter of parties that once echoed in those halls had been replaced by the faint hum of air conditioning and the creak of wooden floors beneath his feet. Loneliness is a strange thing. It doesn't arrive suddenly but grows quietly, like a shadow lengthening in the late afternoon. That shadow had swallowed John whole. There was a time when he could pick up the phone, and dozens of people would answer on the first ring, assistants, advisors, so-called friends, eager to orbit his glow. Now, when the silence rang out, even his own family kept their distance. His daughter Emily hadn't spoken to him in months, hurt by years of his absence at her school recitals and graduations. His ex-wife, Laura, had built a new life far from his, tired of the coldness he brought into their marriage. Even his business partners, once quick to praise him as a genius, whispered about his recent failures, as if his empire were nothing more than smoke and mirrors finally clearing away. Wealth without purpose feels like a prison. John understood that now, in a way, he never had before. He would walk through the endless corridors of his mansion at night, glass of whiskey in hand, asking himself what it had all been for. "What's the point of winning everything?" he muttered once to his reflection in a darkened window. "If in the end you lose yourself." His own voice startled him. It sounded fragile, nothing like the commanding tone that once dictated boardroom decisions. The irony of his success weighed heavily on him. The same ambition that once propelled him to the top had also isolated him. He had made decisions that seemed smart on paper, cutting staff, taking ruthless risks, prioritizing profits above people. Those choices brought him private jets and front-page headlines, but they also carved deep wounds in relationships he could never mend. He remembered Emily's tearful eyes when she asked him, "Daddy, why aren't you ever here?" He had no answer then, just an empty promise that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow never came. The hidden truth about John's journey was that he had always believed he could buy his way out of discomfort. If he felt empty, he purchased another car. If he felt unappreciated, he threw a party to fill the room with applause. But applause fades, and possessions gather dust. The impact of those decisions left scars not only on the people around him, but also on his own soul. Behind the scenes, when the lights dimmed and the world no longer applauded, John was left with only his regrets. There were nights when he would drive aimlessly through the streets of Manhattan, The city that once represented opportunity, now serving as a mirror to his downfall. Neon lights blurred past his windshield as he replayed memories of his earlier years, when he was just a young man with ideas, scribbling dreams into a notebook at a diner in Queens. Back then, he was fueled by passion, by belief, by hope. Somewhere along the way, that fire had been replaced by cold calculation. And now, sitting behind the wheel of a car that most would call a masterpiece, he felt smaller than ever. He remembered one particular evening when he pulled into his driveway and didn't step out of the car right away. He just sat there, listening to the ticking of the engine cooling down. In that quiet, the thought crept in. Maybe this is it. Maybe I've already lived the best parts of my life, and everything ahead is just decline. The millionaire who had once been celebrated as unstoppable now questioned if he had anything left worth living for. John's depression didn't roar like a storm. It whispered like a draft through cracks in the walls. He found himself unable to enjoy meals, unable to focus on conversations, unable to escape the constant hum of failure playing in his mind. He stared at screens filled with numbers, but couldn't make sense of them anymore. Board meetings turned into empty rituals where he felt like an actor reciting lines from a script he no longer believed in. The man who had once been defined by decisive moves now hesitated at everything, paralyzed by the weight of choices that had already been made. And yet, even in this pit of despair, life had its way of setting the stage for something different. John's emptiness was not the end. It was the space being cleared for something he never expected. He didn't know it yet, but the next chapter of his journey was about to be rewritten, not by another contract, not by another business deal, not by another display of wealth. It would be rewritten by a presence so unlikely, so pure, that it would shift his entire mindset in ways he couldn't imagine. The first signs of that transformation came quietly, almost like background noise he didn't notice at first. A distant sound of laughter carried through the street as he stood on his balcony one evening, staring down at the world below. It wasn't the laughter of adults masking pain with shallow jokes, but the free, unguarded laughter of a child. And though he couldn't explain why, something about that sound pierced the walls he had built around his heart. It was as if, in that brief moment, the silence that had consumed him was finally interrupted by a revelation. Perhaps not everything was lost. The emptiness remained, but in the distance, a spark flickered. And that spark was about to grow into a flame he thought he could never feel again. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window with his palms pressed against the cold glass, the city unfurling below like a map of all the choices that had led him here. The skyline glittered with opportunities, neon promises, office towers with their own lifespans of ambition. But to John Anderson, the lights only highlighted the emptiness inside his chest. For a long time, he had measured his worth by net worth, by the size of contracts he could close, and the speed at which markets reacted to his name. Tonight, those measures felt meaningless. Tonight, the numbers on his screens might as well have been static hieroglyphs from a language he no longer understood. He whispered to himself, almost as if saying it aloud could change anything. Maybe this is the end of my story. The penthouse that once signaled triumph now felt more like a mausoleum of his former ambitions. The leather armchairs remained in perfect array, the coffee table curated with design magazines he never read anymore. Even the art on his walls, a collection chosen early in his career to impress clients and collectors, now watched him with indifferent beauty, unable to meet the gaze of a man unraveling. He remembered the pride that came with each acquisition, the way each painting and sculpture once served as a trophy for a life that seemed to be ascending. But trophies gather dust, and trophies do not fix the hollow echo of late nights spent alone, replaying arguments, missed birthdays, and apologies that never reached warm hands. "What have I really won?" he murmured, the question dissolving into the quiet room. That night, the weight of failure was more than financial. It was existential. He had made decisions, calculated, strategic, often ruthless, that had propelled him forward. Those decisions came with a hidden truth. Every closed door in someone else's life had opened a door for him. Layoffs, broken promises, alliances severed for the right quarter's profit, these were the margins in which his empire grew. The impact of those choices was not immediate punishment. It was a slow corrosion of trust, of intimacy, of the small, unnoticed things that give life meaning. He had traded morning pancakes with his daughter for quarterly reports, late-night conversations for conference calls. "I thought I was building a legacy," he admitted to the glass, "but I might have been building a cell." At the height of his success, John never allowed himself to imagine failure. His mindset was bulletproof, aggressive optimism braided with relentless discipline, but discipline turned brittle without purpose. He had believed the myth that control over external circumstances equaled control over inner life. Yet here he was, stripped of certainty, and the facade of mastery crumbled like plaster. The loneliness that set in was not merely the absence of company, it was the absence of meaning. He tried to catalogue what went wrong. Was it the bad investments, the cutthroat expansion into risky markets, the hires that didn't pan out? Maybe. But the real collapse was more intimate. The erosion of connection, the choices that had cost him people who once mattered more than money. He heard his own voice in the empty foyer as if another man were asking questions he had no answer for. "How did I let this happen?" he said. That night, hunger and insomnia became his companions. He walked from room to room, each filled with artifacts of status, and felt none of the satisfaction he had once associated with them. He could summon memories of his younger self, scribbling in a diner at 2 a.m, full of raw, messy belief, convinced that ideas and courage would suffice. Back then, his decisions were guided by curiosity and an appetite for transformation. Now decisions had calcified into risk management and brand preservation. What he once called savvy felt hollow, and he was forced to confront the cost of that savvy. In quieter moments, he would replay conversations in his head. Emily's voice on the phone, tentative and distant. Laura's polite but resolute goodbye. Partner's veiled questions about his stamina. Those moments accumulated into a verdict he could not escape. The man he had become was not the man he once wanted to be. Hopelessness moved in small increments. It arrived as missed calls, as dinners eaten alone, as a parade of guests who would smile politely and then leave without entering his inner life. It showed up when he opened a ledger and found numbers, not meaning, when he watched an award ceremony on television and felt nothing but the reflexive training of a performer. There were nights when he considered erasing everything, selling the properties, disconnecting the accounts, stepping away from the persona that had defined him for decades. The thought of walking away terrified and relieved him in the same breath. "Maybe it's better if I just disappear," he confessed once. The sentence barely a scratch against the vast silence. The confession was both admission and plea. He wanted an out, but he also feared the emptiness that might follow detachment. In the depths of such reflections, memories visited him with sharpened edges, faces of people whose paths he had diverted for the sake of profit. There was the assistant who spent 2 winters helping his children when he was absent. There was the old mentor from Queens who had told him, in a voice that had since become a ghostly echo, that success without empathy was a rusting machine. Those recollections did not indict him so much as they revealed consequences. His ascent had been a series of transactions, and the currency he had spent most recklessly was human trust. He began to see the arc of his life not as a proud curve upwards, but as a tightrope walk that had become unbearable. The breaking point came not with a dramatic collapse, but with the recognition that he had become a spectator in his own life. He realized the days of commanding rooms and setting deals had been replaced by a repetitive cycle: wake, strategize, execute, sleep, without ever asking why. "I've been working to avoid emptiness," John said into the darkness. But I've only been buying ways to look busy. He laughed then, a short, brittle sound that could have been mistaken for a cough. The laugh dissolved quickly. The room remained unmoved. The millionaire had reached a place where applause meant little, and solitude felt like a sentence. He considered his daughter again, the image of her at 16, beauty and rebellion folded together. He imagined her at a recital, piano keys under small fingers, and he remembered promising to be there. He had broken that promise. That failure haunted him more than any market loss. In that haunting, he found an ache that was the clearest measure of what he'd sacrificed for a scoreboard. The scoreboard had been fulfilling at first, an external validation that fed an internal hunger, but validation is fleeting. The hidden truth was becoming evident. Transformation cannot be purchased, it must be lived. Yet, as the hours stretched and the city's hum softened into a distant lullaby, there was a subtle shift, a crack in the armor he had spent his life forging. The certainty that nothing could touch his core had given way to a fragile openness. He did not know how to begin to heal, nor could he imagine the exact path back to meaning, but for the first time in months, he felt the stirrings of curiosity rather than resignation. "I don't want to be this man anymore," he admitted aloud, and the sentence landed like a first stone in still water, making small ripples that hinted at change. That whisper of admission mattered because it signaled a decision, however small, to confront rather than flee. The impact of that decision would not be immediate or grandiose. It would be quiet, marked by small, sometimes awkward steps. He could choose to keep circling the same rituals, or he could let the landscape of his life be rearranged by something unexpected. Outside, a different kind of sound threaded through the night, light, unscripted laughter that belonged to someone who had not yet learned the bitterness of compromise. It threaded through the dark city like a promise, and John, leaning into that window, found himself listening in a way he hadn't in years. The breaking point was not the end, it was the hinge. What came next would shift his mindset in ways he could not forecast, steering him toward decisions and revelations that would challenge everything he had built. The laughter reached him first, a bright ribbon threading through the muted hum of the city night. John had left the window and wandered the streets without a plan, letting his footsteps decide what came next. 2 blocks from his building, he paused beside a corner where an old brick community center stood with its lights still on. Paper stars hung from the windows, hand-drawn planets taped to the glass, and a marker-sketched banner read "Dream Lab Kids Art Night." The sound that drifted out, unguarded, unscheduled, was nothing like the polished laughter at his fundraisers. It was free. He stood in the cool wash of a street lamp and listened, not to analyze or control, but because something in that sound had tugged at a thread in him he hadn't felt in years. Through the open doors, he saw families trickling out with poster tubes and paint-splattered shirts, a behind-the-scenes parade of small triumphs. A little boy darted past with green on his cheek, proclaiming to no one in particular, "I drew a dinosaur that can sing." A girl balanced a galaxy on cardboard as if it were fragile and real. John watched from the threshold like a man looking at a country he'd forgotten how to enter. That's when he noticed the last figure inside, seated at a folding table near the wall. A boy of 10, alone, elbows to the table, head bent over a sheet of paper that was already crowded with lines and light. The boy drew with the intensity of someone who believed his pencil could change the world. Rockets lifted from rooftops, bridges turned into musical staffs, windows became portals. He wore a red hoodie with a fraying huff and had the kind of careful focus adults mistake for quietness. "You'll miss the bus, Ethan," a woman called from the hall, her voice kind but hurried. 2 more minutes, he replied without looking up. Then the pencil paused, and he added almost to himself, 2 minutes can fit a whole idea. There was no complaint in his tone, just certainty, as if ideas were scheduled like trains he refused to miss. John stepped closer, drawn as much by the gravity of the boy's attention as by the art itself. He had been surrounded by designers and consultants for decades, but their sketches were business plans, dressed as dreams, constrained by profit. This was different. Impossible buildings, parks where benches spoke, a billboard that echoed back compliments to strangers. The child's imagination was both naive and exacting, a blueprint for a city that organized itself around delight. John felt a silence inside him shift from heavy to attentive. He realized uncomfortably how long it had been since he'd looked at anything without calculating how it might serve him. "Hey," the boy said, noticing the tall figure hovering at the edge of his orbit. "Do you like rockets?" John almost said yes to be agreeable, but the truth felt required here, in this small nation of paper and markers. "I don't know," he admitted. "I used to like them when I was a kid. Then I got busy." The boy nodded as if this were a medical diagnosis he'd heard before and accepted with sympathy. "Busy is like fog," he said. "You can still have a sky behind it." He introduced himself as Ethan Carter. "I'm 10, but in drawing years I'm like 1,000. He grinned and scooted over, pushing a spare sheet in John's direction. "If you could build anything on this block, what would you build?" The question was so simple that John's practiced mind tried to overcomplicate it. He could have answered hotel or mixed-use tower or cultural hub, the vocabulary of money, but the boy's eyes were waiting for something. Honest, not impressive. "I'd build a place where people can sit and remember things," John heard himself say. "A memory park. No phones." Ethan lit up. "Yes, and the benches could tell stories out loud if you whisper a secret into them." The exchange startled John, not because of the fantasy, but because he felt something loosen inside, an ache releasing by the smallest degree. Ethan returned to his own drawing. "I'm finishing a bridge that sings. It plays different songs depending on the time of day, so the city knows what kind of hug it needs." He drew staff lines into the steel, adding notes as if they were part of the engineering. The child's mindset had no border between art and structure, design and emotion. Where John's adult world divided everything into function and cost, Ethan's decisions were guided by a hidden truth. If you make a thing with love, it will work better. "Do you come here a lot?" John asked. "When my aunt works late," Ethan said. "She says this place is good for my brain. I think it's good for my heart." He glanced up. "Your face looks tired, not sleepy tired, heavy tired." The observation was not rude, it was surgical. John exhaled. "It's been a long year." Ethan nodded like a young archivist of human weather. "Sometimes you need a new dream because the old one got used up." A volunteer stacker asked if they were finished. Ethan raised his hand without looking away from his paper. "One more minute," he said, with a seriousness that made the adult smile. "And move on." He slid a marker across to John. "Do you want to add something?" The instinct to refuse rose quickly, polite decline, efficient exit, but he surprised himself. "Okay," he said, and lowered the marker to the page. His lines were tentative at first, as if he were relearning a language. Then he drew a small room tucked under the singing bridge, a quiet alcove with books and a window facing the river. "What's that?" Ethan asked. "A place for second chances," John answered, and the words landed in his own chest like a soft hammer strike. Outside, a bus hissed. The hall lights dimmed. Ethan blew on the paper because, in his universe, marker ink still needed wind to set. He packed his pencils into a tin dotted with stickers, astronaut, lightning bolt, the word brave in blocky letters. "My aunt is waiting," he said, tugging his sleeve down to cover the worn cuff. Then he looked up with the frank curiosity that had already rearranged John's interior landscape. "Are you going to come back next week? They do architecture with cereal boxes." John almost laughed at the audacity of cereal architecture invading his calendar. "Maybe," he said. "I haven't decided." Ethan smiled like someone who trusted decisions more than doubts. "Deciding is just a door. You can walk through it." In the doorway, a woman in scrubs waved. "Ethan, let's go, kiddo." He held up the paper. "Can he take a picture of it?" She shrugged kindly. "If it's okay with you." Ethan turned to John. "Pictures. Help you remember what you decided when you were brave. The sentence slid into John like a key, into a lock that had been waiting years for the right cut. He took a photo with hands that trembled slightly, a physical proof that something real had happened in this ordinary room. They stepped into the cool night together. The block looked different, less like a ledger of properties and more like a place where people lived their uneven, gorgeous lives. Ethan hopped along the curb, keeping his balance like a wire walker. "Do you live around here?" John asked. "Over on 57th with Aunt Molly. My mom lives in Ohio right now, but she calls on Sundays." He said it without drama, as if these facts were tools he'd learned to carry. "Do you draw at home too?" John asked. "Yeah, but it's loud sometimes. Here, the loud is the good kind." They stopped at the bus stop where a poster advertised a city initiative for after-school programs. John felt an unexpected pinch of shame behind his ribs. He had spoken on panels about philanthropy, donated to public projects with the subtle fanfare that suits watch brands and naming plaques, but he hadn't stepped into the spaces his money claimed to serve. The impact looked different up close, messier, smaller, harder to quantify, and therefore more truthful. He imagined the behind-the-scenes work of keeping a place like that open. Funding gaps, volunteers who show up after hard days, the quiet heroics of people who choose community over comfort. Bus pulled up, the doors side open. Ethan stepped on the first stair, then turned back. "What did you say the little room was called?" John hesitated, then said it like a promise. "A place for second chances." The boy nodded, as if logging an important blueprint into memory. "Okay, then you should draw more of those." He disappeared into the bus with a wave that looked like a salute. The vehicle rumbled away, taillights shrinking, and with them the last flash of red hoodie and marker-stained fingers. John stood alone on the sidewalk, the city now a little less indifferent. He felt the first honest revelation of the night. He wasn't empty because he had nothing. He was empty because he had stopped seeing. He looked at the photo on his phone, the singing bridge, the memory alcove, the notes like constellations of possibility, and he recognized a shift, not in circumstance, but in attention. This wasn't the feverish optimism of a comeback pitch. It was quieter, steadier, the beginning of a journey measured in different units, not market share, not headlines, presence, integrity, repair. He walked home with the drawing still glowing on his screen. On the way, he passed storefronts that had once looked interchangeable and now felt specific. The florist arranging peonies under a pool of warm light, the diner with a chalkboard that read, "Try the pie if you're sad," the security guard who held the door for an older woman and made a joke that brought her eyes to life. None of these were his to own or leverage. They were reminders of an ecosystem sustained by tiny decisions to care. He found himself whispering, not for dramatic effect, but because the words needed gentleness. "I forgot that the world has a pulse." Back in the penthouse, the window no longer felt like an observation deck for superiority. It felt like a frame around a living story. He set the phone beside an old notebook, the one from his Queen's days that he had kept but stopped opening. His fingers hovered over the cover. Then he heard himself, surprised by the sound of his own voice after so much interior noise. "I could try," he said. "I could try to build one place for second chances." The sentence was small and imperfect, and for that reason, it felt true. He went to the kitchen and poured water instead of whiskey, an unremarkable decision that marked a subtle pivot in mindset. He stood there, in the hush between past and possible, and allowed the evening to settle like dust on a shelf right before. A hand reaches out to make space. He could still retreat tomorrow into the safety of metrics and performance. He could deny that a 10-year-old had rearranged him, but the hidden truth was already present. The most durable transformations begin not with grand gestures, but with the first honest yes to something that has no guarantee. He glanced again at the photo. The lines looked almost musical, like a score awaiting players. He remembered Ethan's matter-of-fact wisdom. Busy is like fog deciding. "Here's a door, and felt the land inside him tilt, not dramatically, but enough to redirect the flow of gravity. He could see a possible morning where he showed up at the community center without a sponsor packet, without a press release, simply to sit at a folding table and make something with his hands while children made galaxies out of cardboard and glue. He did not know what that would fix. He only knew that it would be real. He moved through the quiet rooms, and the space felt less like a prison and more like a workshop awaiting a new blueprint. The difference was not architectural, it was spiritual. A boy had offered him a pencil and a portion of a city he carried inside his imagination, and the gift had landed in a place that money could never reach. He left the lights low, the window open a crack, and let the sounds of the street rise. An ambulance wail, a snippet of music from a passing car, the low conversation of two friends saying goodnight. The city was not judging him, it was inviting him to participate. On his coffee table, he placed a blank sheet beside the photo. He didn't start drawing yet. He just allowed the possibility to sit there, unhurried, the way a musician lets silence hold shape before the first note. Somewhere in the distance, a bus braked and released a sigh that sounded almost human. He thought of the boy in the red hoodie, of the aunt in scrubs, of the volunteer who allowed one more minute, because a minute sometimes holds a life. He thought of a small room under a bridge where people whisper into the wood and walk away feeling changed. And as he held that picture steady, the night shifted from something to endure into something preparing the ground. The next movement was finding its rhythm. The next morning, John told himself the encounter from the night before had been nothing more than a fleeting distraction. He woke to the same silence, the same sterile penthouse walls, the same cityscape sprawling beyond his windows. He poured coffee into a crystal mug, stared at the black surface, and convinced himself that whatever he had felt standing beside that boy was temporary. It was nothing, he muttered, as if naming it small would make it disappear. He had work to do, meetings to attend, decisions to make. Dreams belonged to children. Adults dealt with outcomes, not fantasies. But the photograph remained on his phone, stubborn and insistent. When he scrolled past it, he felt the tug again, the singing bridge, the little alcove of second chances. He closed the screen quickly, irritated by his own softness. That irritation grew stronger when, a week later, his footsteps carried him back toward the community center. He hadn't planned it. He told himself he was simply walking to clear his head, to escape the sterile air of his penthouse. Yet his body seemed to move with its own quiet logic, leading him back to the building with paper stars in the windows. Inside, the laughter rose again, and there was Ethan, seated. At the same folding table, hoodie sleeves pulled over his hands, sketching as though the entire city depended on his imagination. John hesitated at the door. A voice inside him, hardened by years of control and superiority, insisted he had no place here. He was a man of boardrooms and contracts, not glue sticks and crayons. He turned to leave, but Ethan spotted him and waved with the casual certainty of someone who expected him to return. "Hey, you came back!" John froze. He could have denied it, claimed coincidence, pretended indifference. Instead, he walked forward with a stiffness that betrayed his discomfort. "I was just passing by," he said, his tone clipped, businesslike. Ethan shrugged, unfazed. "Good timing. I need help with clouds." The man almost laughed at the absurdity of it. "Clouds," he repeated, eyebrow raised. "Yeah," Ethan replied, pointing to the page. "They're not supposed to just sit there. They need to tell stories." He pushed the marker toward John again. The gesture made John bristle. He was not accustomed to being summoned into someone else's vision, especially not by a child. He folded his arms. "I don't draw," he said flatly. Ethan tilted his head, studying him the way children do when they sense more than adults admit. "Maybe you forgot," he said simply. The words were disarming, too direct to dismiss. John felt irritation rising, a reflex against vulnerability. He wanted to push back, to assert the authority that had defined his life. "Look," He began, voice edged with steel. "I don't have time for—" But Ethan cut in without rudeness, his innocence carrying a sharper honesty than confrontation. "Why do grown-ups stop dreaming?" The question hung in the air like a stone dropped into water. John blinked, caught off guard. "What?" he asked, buying time. Ethan repeated it, slower this time. "Why do grown-ups stop dreaming?" The man felt his jaw tighten. He could have delivered a rehearsed speech about responsibilities, about reality, about how the world demanded practicality. That was the armor he had worn for decades. Yet under Ethan's gaze, the words shriveled before they reached his lips. He settled on a brusque dismissal. "Because dreams don't pay bills." Ethan didn't flinch. "Maybe not. But no dreams makes life heavy. That's worse." He returned to his sketch, as if the conversation had already given him what he needed. John stood there, strangely unsettled. He wanted to assert control, to remind himself that he was the adult, the millionaire, the one who understood how the world really worked. But the boy's sentence pressed into him with the weight of a revelation he didn't want to face, that he had built his empire on numbers while starving the part of himself that once dreamed. Annoyance bubbled up, a shield against the discomfort. He leaned down and said sharply, "You'll understand when you're older." Ethan looked up calmly, his eyes wide, unclouded. "Or maybe you'll understand when you're younger," he answered. The remark hit harder than any insult. It wasn't rebellion, it was purity. John straightened, unsettled, and turned away, scanning the room as if searching for an escape. Children buzzed around with cardboard towers, paper wings, laughter spilling like sunlight. He felt like a foreigner among them, overdressed and out of place, his silence a stark contrast to their noise. His instinct was to retreat, to reassert the boundaries that kept him safe. But Ethan's words followed him like an echo he couldn't shake. Later, seated in his car, he replayed the exchange. Why do grown-ups stop dreaming? The question gnawed at him, not because of its simplicity, but because of the hidden truth beneath it. Somewhere along his journey, he had stopped. Not paused, not delayed. Stopped. He had once dreamed of building not just wealth, but meaning. He had imagined creating spaces where people thrived, where possibility was nurtured. Those visions had been devoured by ambition, stripped away by a mindset obsessed with efficiency. The boy's innocent question had unearthed that forgotten layer, and John felt exposed. He told himself he was angry at the child's impertinence, at the intrusion into a world he had mastered. But anger was easier than admitting the impact. The arrogance that had long protected him clashed violently with the humility that Ethan embodied. Power met purity, and for the first time in years, John wasn't sure which one carried more weight. That night, back in the penthouse, he poured whiskey into a glass and found it bitter. He set it down untouched, pacing the length of the room. His reflection in the window no longer looked like control, it looked like exhaustion. He whispered the boy's question into the empty air. "Why do grown-ups stop dreaming?" The sound of it coming from his own lips felt both humiliating and liberating. He didn't have an answer yet, but the question refused to let him go. It clung to him, insistent, as if waiting for him to choose between continuing the performance of power or allowing himself to rediscover what purity could still awaken. And with each step across that vast, echoing floor, he sensed that the next encounter with Ethan would not be something he could dismiss so easily. John hadn't intended to return again, and yet a week later his shoes were carrying him down the same block, past the same brick building with paper stars taped to the windows. He told himself it was coincidence, a meaningless detour. But deep inside he knew that wasn't true. Something in him craved the noise of that place, the unpolished laughter, the way children seemed to breathe without weight. When he stepped through the doors this time, he spotted Ethan right away. Red hoodie, sleeves still frayed, hunched over another sheet of paper as though the entire universe waited for his approval. John hovered for a moment, the old instinct to retreat clawing at him, but the boy looked up, grinned and said simply, "You're late." It wasn't an accusation, just a fact stated with childlike certainty, as though John had already agreed to be part of this world. The man raised an eyebrow. Late for what? Ethan pushed the markers toward him. The rocket launch. On the paper, Ethan had drawn a towering rocket rising from the middle of Central Park, flames bursting in vibrant streaks of orange and blue. Around it, he sketched tiny people with their heads tilted back, watching in awe. The rocket wasn't labeled with corporate, logos, or weighed down with technical details. It was pure imagination, a vessel built not of steel, but of hope. It's going to Mars, Ethan explained, but it makes a stop on the moon because astronauts should get a view before they go too far. John smirked, despite himself. That's not how it works. Ethan shot him a quick glance, unbothered. Maybe not for you. For me it does. Then he added, you don't get it. Dreams don't have to follow rules first. They make the rules later. The boy's words were like sparks hitting dry timber inside John, igniting memories of the man he had been before profits eclipsed vision. He remembered being 19, sketching ideas in notebooks at a Queen's diner, believing he would build things that mattered. Somewhere along the way, those ideas had been replaced by spreadsheets. Ethan went on, flipping to another page with restless energy. I'm going to be an astronaut one day, or maybe a writer, or maybe a pilot. He grinned, showing a missing tooth. I haven't decided yet, so I'll just do all three. John chuckled, shaking his head. You can't do everything. Ethan looked up sharply. Why not? The man opened his mouth to explain the constraints of reality, time, effort, the unforgiving decisions of adulthood, but stopped. The boy's gaze demanded honesty, not lectures. Because grown-ups, he began, then trailed off. Ethan filled the silence. Because grown-ups forget how to try. That sentence lingered. John sat down without realizing it, lowering himself onto the folding chair across from the boy. For years, he had been treated with reverence, deferential nods, cautious tones, polished greetings. Here, he was just another man with empty hands. He watched as Ethan's pencil danced across the page, turning skyscrapers into rocket platforms, drawing a library that floated among the stars, a playground carved into the moon's surface. The boy narrated as he went. Here's where kids read stories that actually come alive. Here's where pilots fly without planes, and here's where astronauts rest when they're tired, because even heroes need naps. John felt something stirring, a long-buried ache. It wasn't just admiration for the child's imagination. It was recognition of what he had once carried inside himself. He remembered lying on the hood of his father's old car at night, staring at constellations, telling himself he would build something great, something that changed lives. Back then, his vision wasn't about empires or dominance. It was about possibility. You really think you can do all that? John asked softly. Ethan didn't hesitate. Of course, dreams are like spare keys. You just need the right one for the right door. He paused, then looked directly at John. If you lost your dream, you can always borrow mine until you find yours again. The words struck him harder than he wanted to admit. Borrow a dream. He had spent years believing dreams were for the young and naive, not for men with reputations to protect and debts to pay. And yet, here was a 10-year-old offering him something more valuable than money, status, or control. A temporary anchor until he rediscovered his own. John cleared his throat, trying to steady himself. What if I break it? Ethan shrugged. Then we tape it back together. That's what second chances are for. For the first time in years, John laughed. Not the hollow chuckle he used at galas or interviews, but a genuine laugh that loosened his chest. It startled him. He hadn't realized how foreign joy had become. The boy grinned back, satisfied, as though laughter itself was proof of success. Around them, other children ran with paper kites and cardboard swords, but the table felt like its own universe. John picked up a marker without thinking and added a small figure to the drawing, a man in a suit standing among the kids, gazing up at the rocket. Ethan noticed immediately. Is that you? John hesitated. Maybe. I'm not sure I belong there. Ethan tilted his head. Everyone belongs in a dream. That's the rule. The simplicity of it undid him. No negotiation, no contract, no exclusivity clause, just belonging. He felt an unexpected warmth in his chest, the faintest flicker of what he thought had died. As the boy filled another page with wild possibilities, rivers that sang, elevators that reached the clouds, John sat quietly, realizing that imagination had more power to heal than any number on a screen ever had. He looked down at the child's work, at the messy brilliance of it, and whispered almost to himself, "I used to draw cities once. Not like this, but I had ideas." Ethan leaned forward, curious. "What happened?" John pressed his lips together, the hidden truth heavy in his throat. "I traded them for something else." He didn't say the word money, but it hovered unspoken between them. Ethan nodded slowly, as though he understood more than his years suggested. "Then maybe it's time to trade back." The phrase rattled around in John's head. Long after he left the community center, walking through the city that night, he noticed things he hadn't before. The mural painted on a brick wall, the music of a street performer echoing off the subway stairs, the way strangers held conversations that carried laughter in their rhythm. It felt like the world was showing him sketches he had ignored, details in the margins of life he had once been too busy to see. Back in his penthouse, he sat at the table and pulled out the notebook he hadn't touched in years. Its pages were yellowed, the edges curled, but the first entries were alive with ambition. He traced his fingers over faded words, notes about projects that never happened, buildings that never stood. He whispered into the quiet, "Borrow a dream." The phrase carried a weight he couldn't shake, and he knew that Ethan's imagination had not just entertained him, it had awakened something restless, something that refused to go back to sleep. He left the notebook open that night, pen resting on the page, as though his hand might move while he dreamed, and as he finally drifted into sleep, the city outside no longer felt like a stage for his downfall. It felt like a canvas waiting for a new line to be drawn. John woke the next morning with the notebook still open beside him, pen uncapped, as if his hand had been preparing all night to rediscover a forgotten rhythm. The city light filtered through the glass, softer than usual, as though even the sunrise sensed something had shifted inside him. For years, he had woken with heaviness, with the weight of unread emails and looming losses pressing on his chest before he even stood up. But that morning carried a different texture. It wasn't relief, his problems hadn't vanished, but the silence in the room felt less suffocating. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and caught himself staring at the faint outline of the figure he had sketched under Ethan's rocket, a man in a suit standing among children, looking up. The image lingered. He whispered into the quiet, almost embarrassed, "Could this child really awaken a soul I thought was dead?" The question was absurd, even laughable, but it felt truer than anything he had told himself in years. He closed the notebook and set it on the counter, not out of dismissal, but as if to say, not yet, but soon. Later that day, as he walked the streets, memories began to surface uninvited. He passed a diner on the corner, and suddenly he was 19 again, hunched over, chipped. Tables, scribbling ideas into cheap spiral notebooks while sipping burnt coffee. Back then, ambition wasn't tied to dollars, it was tied to creation. He had wanted to design something that mattered, to build structures that carried meaning. He remembered sketching a library shaped like an open book, a bridge lined with lanterns that lit up as people walked across. Those visions had been bold, maybe impossible, but they had been alive. Now, walking past that diner, he realized he had buried that. Fire under layers of strategy, efficiency, and control. He had made decisions that looked brilliant on paper, but killed something essential inside him. The hidden truth was clear. The man celebrated as a visionary had long ago stopped seeing. And yet Ethan's words, "Dreams don't have to follow rules first," echoed like a dare. The transformation didn't arrive in one dramatic moment. It seeped into the small gestures. That afternoon, when his driver asked a question about rerouting traffic, John actually listened instead of brushing him off. Later, at a meeting, instead of snapping at a junior associate fumbling with slides, he leaned back and said quietly, "Take your time." The others at the table looked surprised, but John didn't notice. He was too busy noticing himself. The smallest choices, he realized, carried impact. A smile, where once there was silence; patience, where once there was pressure. That evening, he caught himself laughing at a memory. His daughter Emily, running across a soccer field, hair flying, waving at him in the stands. He had missed most of those games, buried in calls, but he remembered one afternoon when he arrived late, and she still waved like he was the most important person in the world. The memory burned, but instead of burying it, he let himself feel the weight. "I used to be her dream," he murmured, voice tight. He wondered if there was still time to trade back, to earn even a fragment of that trust again. Days passed, and John found himself circling back to the community center more than once. Sometimes he stayed in the doorway, content just to listen. Ethan's imagination spilled into the air like paint. New worlds, impossible inventions, futures bright with possibility. One afternoon, the boy showed him a drawing of a playground where slides were built into waterfalls and swings soared above treetops. "When I'm a pilot, I'll fly over this park every day," Ethan said with conviction. John smirked. "You're still set on being everything?" Ethan grinned. "Of course. Why choose one dream when you can carry a backpack full of them?" John chuckled, shaking his head, but the boy's certainty had a way of piercing through his cynicism. He noticed how Ethan's innocence wasn't naive. It was resilient. Every sketch, every wild declaration was an act of defiance against the world's insistence on limitation. And each time John heard him speak, he felt that same old fire spark inside, fragile but undeniable. In quiet moments, he replayed Ethan's offer, "Borrow my dream until you find yours again." He had dismissed so many offers in his life, partnerships, invitations, even love, but this one lingered. A 10-year-old had given him something no boardroom could, permission to start over without shame. It haunted him in the best way possible. One night, he sat at his dining table with a blank sheet of paper and tried to draw. His hand trembled at first, lines crooked and unsure, but slowly a shape began to form. A bridge, not one of steel and concrete, but one that seemed to glow. As he drew, he smiled, an involuntary, genuine smile that softened the hard edges of his face. He leaned back and whispered, "I thought that part of me was gone." The smile remained, proof that it wasn't. The shift was subtle but constant. He found himself pausing at small things. The laughter of children on the street, the mural of colors sprayed across an alley wall, the way strangers helped an elderly man cross the road. Each moment carried weight, not in profit but in presence. He began to understand that his journey forward wasn't about rebuilding an empire. It was about rebuilding himself. And yet, beneath the warmth of these new stirrings, questions pressed at him. Could he truly change, or was this just a temporary illusion, a distraction from the wreckage of his choices? Was it possible for a man who had spent decades chasing numbers to finally chase meaning instead? The curiosity unsettled him, but it also drove him forward. Back in his penthouse one evening, he looked at the skyline with fresh eyes. The towers once symbolized competition, battles won and lost. Now they looked like fragile monuments, temporary spikes in the horizon. He wondered how many people in those buildings felt what he had felt, alone, heavy, suffocated by success. The thought stirred something unfamiliar, compassion. "Maybe I'm not the only one who forgot how to dream," he said softly, as if confessing to the city itself. He returned to the notebook again, filling its pages with rough sketches. Not polished plans, not business strategies, just shapes, images, fragments of ideas. A community library shaped like a lantern, a garden built on rooftops, a bridge that hummed when people walked across it. They weren't investments, they were possibilities, and with every line, he felt closer to the boy he had once been. As the days blended, John realized he was smiling more often, not forced, not calculated, but because something inside him had been reignited. He listened when people spoke. He paused to notice the world around him. And in the quiet of his penthouse, he no longer felt only emptiness. He felt anticipation, as if the ground beneath him was shifting. The question that haunted him most, though, remained. Could a child's imagination really awaken a soul thought long dead? Each time he saw Ethan's wide eyes, each time he heard his voice declaring futures without fear, John believed it a little more. He could feel the transformation taking root, not in grand gestures, but in the smallest acts of noticing, of caring, of daring to believe again. And as he stood one evening, notebook in hand, gazing out at the city's restless lights, he understood that this inner shift was not the end of something. It was the beginning of a journey that would test not just his resolve, but the very essence of who he was becoming. The changes started so small that John almost missed them. He passed the art store on Lexington that he'd walked by 100 times, the one with paint-splattered windows and a bell that chimed like a bicycle when the door opened. Usually, he would have kept moving, eyes forward, mind locked onto the next obligation. But something tugged at him, an inner nudge that felt like a gentle hand on his sleeve. He stepped inside and found himself surrounded by aisles of markers, watercolors, sketchbooks, and brushes arranged like instruments waiting for the right song. Without analyzing it to death, he pulled a basket from the stack and began placing things inside. Fine-tip pens, a tin of colored pencils, a heavy pad of drawing paper that promised no bleed-through, and a pack of stickers with stars and rockets and a cartoon pilot saluting. At the counter, when the clerk asked if he needed a gift receipt, John shook his head. "No," he said, surprising himself with the softness in his voice. "This is exactly what it's supposed to be." He carried the bag to the community center that afternoon, half expecting to feel foolish when he handed it over. But when Ethan saw the supplies, the boy's face broke into a grin so unguarded it felt like the room itself had been given more oxygen. "Are these for the rocket lab?" Ethan asked, already lifting the pencils like precious metal. "They're for whatever your brain can't stop imagining," John answered. The boy nodded seriously, as if accepting a tool for a mission already underway. He arranged the items with the precision of a small engineer, then looked up and said, "We should go to the park. The clouds are moving like they have ideas." They crossed through Central Park as Saturday loosened people's shoulders. A saxophone played somewhere near the Bethesda terrace, a lazy ribbon of melody winding between trees. Ethan walked a few steps ahead, swinging the art store bag like a bell. "Do you hear how the wind says shh?" he asked, tilting his head. "It's like the sky is trying to tell us a secret, but doesn't want to scare it." John smiled, the expression arriving without his permission. "What's the secret?" Ethan shrugged. "Maybe that everything wants to be something more if we let it." They set up at a bench near the lake. Children threw bread to geese, a jogger slowed to tie his shoe, a couple debated whether the water was green or silver. Ethan pulled out the heavy pad and began sketching the line of the shoreline, then the curve of the bridge, then the suggestion of the city rising beyond the trees. "I'm practicing seeing," he said. "You can't just draw. You have to look, then listen, then draw." John watched him work and felt that statement land with the quiet authority of truth. Listening before acting had never been his reflex. He had always moved first, corrected later, then called the correction a strategy. But Ethan's method, look, listen, draw, sounded like a new mindset, a way to slow the impulse to control and replace it with attention. "Want to try?" the boy asked, pushing the pencils across the bench. John hesitated, the old armor rattling. "I'm out of practice." Ethan's response was immediate. "Good. Practice is where the fun is." The man laughed under his breath. He took the pencil, held it like something both familiar and foreign, and made a shy line on the page. The world didn't change. No one judged him. The line curved, steadied, continued. He drew the bridge first, then a rectangle that became a small pavilion on the water, then an arch that didn't exist in real life, but made scents in his hand. The scene before him and the one inside his head braided together until the paper felt generous enough to hold both. They spent an hour there. Ethan narrated his own universe between strokes, how someday he would be a pilot and write books on long flights when the clouds looked like pages, how astronauts probably felt the Earth humming even from far away, how Brooklyn would look from the sky like a quilt sewn by a grandmother with bright scraps of memory. John listened instead of shutting those words out with adult practicality. "When I'm an astronaut," Ethan declared, "I'm going to take a notebook and write what the moon sounds like." John looked over, amused. "What does it sound like?" Ethan considered. "Like a drum with a very old heart." The boy's sentences rearranged John's interior furniture. He didn't roll his eyes. He didn't correct with facts. He just let the images do their work. Somewhere behind the scenes of his own thoughts, something uncoiled, wonder. That long-exiled citizen of his adult mind, returning with a passport stamped by a child. They packed up when the light shifted to late afternoon, the park turning gold in a way that made even the city's hard edges look kind. As they stood to leave, Ethan tapped the sketch pad. "You did that," he said, pointing to John's quiet pavilion by the water. "That place looks like it knows how to listen." In the days that followed, their meetings became an unspoken ritual. John would bring small things: a roll of painter's tape so the paper wouldn't curl, a pencil sharpener shaped like a spaceship, a pocket dictionary because Ethan had asked how to spell constellation. In return, Ethan gave him intangible gifts that couldn't be purchased. On one afternoon filled with thin rain, the boy taught him how to hear laughter without defense. They traced raindrops sliding down the window and named them like characters in a story. "This one is brave," Ethan said, following a drop that held the line all the way to the bottom. "This one is shy," John offered, pointing to a droplet that kept hitching rides with bigger ones. They laughed at the tiny drama of water and glass, and for the first time in years, John felt joy that wasn't attached to achievement. Another day, when the community center hosted a reading circle, Ethan insisted John sit with them. He listened as a volunteer read from a book about a pilot navigating by stars, the words landing like coordinates. When the reader asked what stars were good for, Ethan's hand shot up. "For finding your way when maps forget you," he said. John closed his eyes briefly at the sentence, recognizing himself in the lostness it implied. He whispered, not for anyone else to hear, "Maps have forgotten me for a while." There were moments when John's old reflexes tried to reclaim ground. He would catch himself reaching for control, wanting to direct the boy's creative chaos into a neat plan. But then Ethan would do something so startlingly present, offer the last marker to another kid with a simple, "You need the blue more than me," or tell a joke that collapsed into giggles, that John's control dissolved. He began to experience the impact of kindness at scale, not as a philanthropic initiative, but as a living practice measured in micro-decisions. A sticker offered, a place saved at a table, a story listened to the end. The hidden truth emerging from this behind-the-scenes journey was that John wasn't mentoring Ethan. If anything, he was the apprentice. The boy's instructions were unspoken but clear. Move slower, pay attention, trust your own hands, don't be afraid of the messy draft. When John apologized for smudging graphite across a page, Ethan shrugged. Smudges make shadows. Shadows make light look brighter. It sounded like art class, but John heard life coaching in it, a set of revelations disguised as simplicity. At night, he returned to his penthouse and opened the old notebook again. The pages that followed were different from the careful strategies of his past. They were messy, exploratory, full of crossings out and arrows guiding ideas toward each other. He wrote in block letters across one page, "Listen before you build." On another page, he mapped a project that was less a project and more a promise, an underbridge alcove for second chances, a place where grief could sit beside hope without being asked to hurry. He felt almost giddy, like the 19-year-old in the Queen's diner. "I forgot how it Feels to start, he said into the room, his voice less lonely than before. He started noticing ways to help that weren't about money, but attention. When Aunt Molly arrived late one evening, shoulders sagging from a hospital double shift, John took the art bag from Ethan's hands and carried it to the bus stop so the boy could keep drawing until the last moment. "Thank you," Molly said, surprised. John nodded. "You keep New York breathing. Carrying a bag is the least I can do." She smiled, a beshita, small, tired grace that felt like a blessing. Another Saturday, he showed up early with a thermos of hot chocolate and paper cups. He poured for the kids and listened to their wind-up stories. Lost dogs found, science projects, playground politics. When a girl showed him a drawing of a house with 10 doors, he asked why so many. "For neighbors," she said plainly, "so no one gets stuck outside." The sentence stuck to him like a decal he carried through the day. He walked past glass towers later and wondered how many doors in his world had been built only for people like him. These gestures didn't erase his past, and he knew that. The transformation underway wasn't a public rebrand. It was an inner renovation, one decision at a time. He found himself breaking old habits in subtle ways. He reached for water more often than whiskey. He left his phone in a drawer for an hour and survived the experiment. He called Emily, and when the voicemail picked up, he did not leave a strategic message. "About schedules and logistics," he said. "Hi, it's Dad. I'm learning how to listen better. I'd like to hear whatever you want to say." He hung up and sat with the tremor that followed, understanding that change carries risk, but silence carries a cost. On a windy afternoon, Ethan insisted they test paper airplanes in the courtyard behind the center. John folded his with loyally precision. Ethan crumpled and refolded his with chaotic confidence. Ethan's flew farther. "Why?" John asked genuinely. "Curious." The boy explained with the earnestness of a young engineer. "Yours is perfect, so it's scared to be wrong. Mine's a little wrong, so it's brave." John laughed until he leaned against the brick wall, holding his stomach. "That's ridiculous," he said, then added, "and maybe true." The laughter cracked something open. John felt his posture change, his shoulders loosen, the protective seriousness that had armored him for years becoming less necessary. He didn't become a different person in a day, but he became a person more willing to be different. He took the long way home just to pass the mural again. He paused at a street performer's song, not because it was part of a curated experience, but because it caught him mid-thought and handed him a better one. He thanked his doorman by name and meant it. These were small acts, but each carried the weight of a decision to be present. Back at his table that night, he wrote across the top of a fresh page, "Reasons to build what doesn't. Make sense yet." Under it, he listed things that would have sounded unserious a month earlier, because wonder heals, because laughter shortens the distance between strangers, because hope recalibrates the compass when the map is wrong. The page filled quickly, his handwriting slanting with an urgency that felt like a reunion with himself. He added one more line at the bottom, then circled it, "Because a 10-year-old believes I can." He began carrying the notebook everywhere, tucked into a leather folio, like a quiet rebellion against the sterile efficiency that had run his life. On the subway, yes, he started taking the subway on purpose. He sketched faces and columns and a bench design that curved like a listening ear. "I'm drawing again," he confessed to his reflection in the train window, surprised by the thrill in his chest. "I thought that part of me was gone." The reflection did not nod back, but something in his eyes looked awake. He helped the center quietly too, asking Molly what they actually needed, instead of assuming he knew. Sometimes the answer was simple. Storage bins, replacement brushes, a new power strip so 3 tables could plug in lamps at once. Other times it was time, an extra adult to run tape around the edge of a mural so paint wouldn't bleed, a pair of hands to sweep at the end of the night. He left his name off donation receipts when he could, learning the difference between impact and attention. Behind the scenes, he studied what kept the place alive, The volunteer who arrived even on bad days, the director who wrote grants at midnight, the way small funds stretched because someone believed in them. And always, there was Ethan. The boy showed him how to walk through the city like a scavenger hunt for wonder, a fire escape that looked like a staircase to nowhere, a puddle holding a skyscraper in perfect miniature, a pigeon hopping with choreography. "Look," Ethan would say, tugging his sleeve, "it's all trying to be seen." John's default had been to curate, to rank, to judge. The child taught him to notice. The shift in mindset felt like a private revolution. One quiet evening, when the air smelled like rain, they sat by the window at the center, with the city soft around the edges. Ethan flipped through the notebook John carried and stopped at the sketch of the underbridge alcove. "You're building it," he said, not as a question but as an observation pulled from the future. John swallowed. "I don't know how yet." Ethan nodded. "That's okay. How can come later. Why goes first." The boy turned a page and handed the pen back. "Write it again, so it knows you mean it." John bent over the paper and wrote, slowly and clearly, "A place for second chances." He underlined it, then whispered, "I mean it." The sentence didn't solve anything. It didn't pay for materials or permissions or labor. But it anchored him to a direction. He could feel the old part of himself, the builder, the dreamer, stepping forward. He had spent years outsourcing his soul to performance metrics. Now he was insourcing it to purpose. He closed the notebook and touched the cover like a threshold. "Thank you," he said, not sure if he meant the boy, the room, or the stubborn pulse of his own heart. Ethan smiled. "You're welcome. You're doing great at being new." On his way home, the city looked like an orchestra tuning before the first movement. He imagined the singing bridge, the lantern library, the listening bench, not as fantasies, but as coordinates. His journey wasn't a comeback tour. It was a beginning, a recalibration of what success would mean if measured by human warmth. And as he stepped into the lobby of his building, he caught himself humming without noticing, the kind of absent song that happens when the mind is busy assembling a future from courage. The elevator doors opened. He rode up, notebook in hand, the night waiting like a page he was ready to mark with the next honest line. John sat at his dining table, one evening with the city stretching below him like a restless ocean of light. His penthouse was as immaculate as ever, but it no longer looked like a monument. It looked like an empty stage after the audience had gone home. He ran his hand across the grain of the table, staring at the old notebook open before him. The last words he had written, "A place for second chances," seemed to pulse on the page, carrying more weight than any contract he had ever signed. For years, he had told himself that money was the only reliable answer, the only shield against fear. But as he sat there, remembering Ethan's wide eyes and stubborn imagination, he realized the hidden truth. Money had never been the solution. It had been a mask, a performance, a distraction. What he had been searching for all along was connection, innocence and love, things that could not be bought, only received and given. The revelation arrived without trumpets or applause, just the quiet clarity of a man stripped of excuses. He thought back to the night he first heard Ethan's laughter outside the community center, how the sound had pierced through years of silence. He had resisted it, dismissed it, even mocked it in his mind, but it had followed him, thread by thread, until it unraveled the armor he had built. Redemption wasn't an event. It was this, sitting alone in a skyscraper, admitting to himself that he had been wrong about almost everything. He whispered into the empty room, "I don't need more walls. I need more bridges." The phrase startled him with its honesty, but it was the only one that felt right. He could see now that his wealth had been a fortress, but what he longed for was the messy, unpredictable warmth of human connection. He closed his eyes and saw Ethan's drawings, rockets stopping at the moon, playgrounds that touched the clouds, benches that told stories when whispered to. The boy's imagination had not only opened a window, it had lit a fire in the ashes of his forgotten self. The car Decision came slowly, like dawn pushing through stubborn clouds. John would support Ethan's dreams, not out of pity, but out of recognition. The boy carried the very thing he had lost, belief that life was more than transactions. "If he wants to be an astronaut, I'll find a way to show him the stars," John murmured. "If he wants to be a writer, I'll make sure he has paper and ink until his hands are tired. If he wants to be a pilot, I'll help him find the wings." But more than that, John would use this journey to rediscover his own dreams, the ones buried beneath decades of ambition. He began with small steps. The next Saturday, he arrived at the community center earlier than usual, carrying not just supplies, but an invitation. "I was thinking," he said, awkward in his delivery, "maybe we could go to the planetarium this weekend. I know someone who can get us inside after hours." Ethan's face lit up like someone had handed him a telescope to his own future. "Can we sit in the front? Row where the stars look like they're falling on you?" he asked. John smiled. "We'll sit wherever you want." That night, under the dome, a simulated galaxy spun overhead. John listened to Ethan narrate constellations as if he were already a tour guide of the universe. "That one looks like a kite," the boy whispered, "and that one looks like a door." John tilted his head, seeing shapes he had never noticed. The boy's voice filled the darkness, more luminous than the stars projected above. And, in that moment, John realized redemption wasn't about repairing the past. It was about building a future worth living in. The shift grew stronger with each encounter. He found himself calling Emily again, this time not to apologize in a rehearsed way, but to ask, "What are you dreaming about these days?" The silence on the line stretched, but then her voice came, hesitant but real. "You never asked me that before." He swallowed hard. "I know. I should have. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough. But it was a beginning." He could feel the bridge forming plank by plank. John started seeing his wealth differently, not as a scoreboard, but as raw material, clay that could be reshaped into something meaningful. He reached out to Molly quietly, asking what the community center needed most. When she listed repairs, scholarships for summer programs, and resources for art nights, he didn't announce donations with plaques or publicity. He simply made them happen. Behind the scenes, he redirected funds that once went to vanity projects into something that breathed life into others. The impact wasn't measured in profit margins, but in crayons, brushes, and laughter. And to his surprise, that impact filled him more than any quarterly gain ever had. At home, he began filling page after page of his notebook with designs not for skyscrapers, but for spaces that fostered belonging. A garden carved into a rooftop for families who couldn't leave the city. A library with windows that opened wide to let children read under sunlight. A bridge with alcoves for second chances, where people could sit and whisper secrets into the wood. He drew them not as pictures, but as prayers. Ethan noticed the change, too. One afternoon, as John bent over a page, sketching with the intensity of his younger self, the boy leaned close and asked, "Are you dreaming again?" John looked up, caught between pride and humility. "I think I am." Ethan grinned. "Good. I told you you could borrow mine, but it looks like you found your own." That sentence sealed the arc of his redemption. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He wasn't just patching the cracks of despair. He was building again, this time not for power, but for purpose. He understood now that despair had been a symptom of disconnection, and hope was the cure offered by innocence. He had walked from emptiness to anticipation, from silence to laughter, from isolation to relationship. Yet even in this newfound clarity, John knew his journey was far from finished. Redemption wasn't a destination, it was a decision renewed each day. As he watched Ethan draw galaxies with markers that smudged onto his sleeves, John felt the truth press into him with gentle insistence. He had been given a second chance, not just by a child's imagination, but by the courage to believe that his own life could be rewritten. And as he closed the notebook that night, placing it carefully beside his bed, he understood that the story of his transformation was only beginning to unfold, The man who once thought his life was over now stood on the edge of something greater, uncertain of the details, but certain of the direction. The city outside pulsed with light, but for the first time in years, the brightest illumination was within him, waiting to guide him toward what came next. John's redemption did not come with parades or headlines, but with the quiet rhythm of small choices stacking one on top of another until the weight of his despair gave way to something lighter. For a man who had once measured his worth by the height of his towers, it was almost ironic that his greatest transformation was invisible to the outside world. The hidden truth of his journey was that he had not been rescued by wealth, nor by some elaborate strategy, but by the fragile persistence of a child's voice, reminding him of the possibilities he had abandoned. He began to see patterns everywhere. In the way Ethan's laughter cracked open the silence of a sterile room, he recognized the sheer impact of joy as a form of rebellion against emptiness. In the way Molly returned to the center each evening, tired but resolute, he saw resilience not as a corporate buzzword, but as an act of love. Even the small exchanges between strangers on the subway or in a park felt like behind-the-scenes revelations of a truth he had forgotten. People, not possessions, give life its texture. There were still moments of doubt. Late at night, he would stare at the notebook filled with messy sketches and wonder if he was fooling himself. He feared sliding back into the old mindset where everything was measured in gains and losses. But then he remembered Ethan's calm certainty, the way the boy had said, "Dreams don't have to follow rules first. They make the rules later." That sentence was no longer just a child's whimsy. It had become a compass for a man who had lost his direction. Sometimes John caught himself reflecting on the way power had once distorted his vision. He had believed that strength was about command, about bending the world to his will. But now he saw power differently. Real power was being able to soften, to listen, to risk vulnerability in order to connect. He had spent decades terrified of appearing weak. Yet the boy who had nothing but crayons and imagination had shown him that humility was not weakness at all. It was the foundation for any lasting hope. The life lesson crystallized in him, like a truth he had known all along but forgotten. He whispered it to himself one evening while walking home under the glow of the city lights. Sometimes it takes the smallest voice to remind us of the biggest truths. Wealth fades, power breaks, but the innocence of a child can awaken a soul that thought it was lost forever. He stopped in his tracks after saying it, realizing the words were not just a reflection of Ethan's impact, they were the story of his own rebirth. From that point on, his notebook was no longer just paper and ink. It was a record of his new purpose. Each page, filled with bridges, parks, libraries, and hidden alcoves, symbolized not just designs, but decisions. Decisions to live differently, to measure success not by profit, but by presence. And though he didn't know how many of these ideas would ever leave the page, the act of drawing them was already changing him. For the first time in years, his nights were no longer haunted by silence, but filled with anticipation. He began to see his wealth as fuel for dreams, bigger than himself. Supporting Ethan's journey was only the beginning. The boy had become a mirror, reflecting the possibility of what John could still become. This was no longer about charity or appearances. It was about redemption lived out in real time. The transformation of a man who had once given up on everything, only to find hope in the most unexpected of places. And as he stood at his window one evening, the skyline shimmering with its restless ambition, he no longer felt trapped behind glass. He felt connected, part of something larger than his own story. His journey wasn't over. It had barely begun. And that lingering question, the one that kept him awake not with dread but with curiosity, was no longer about what he had lost. It was about what he could still build. Would you like to know what John did next with his new dream? There's a story right here that continues this journey. And if you've stayed with me until this point, it probably means something in John's journey resonated with you too. Maybe you've carried some of that same weight he did, or maybe you've been reminded, like he was, that even the smallest spark can change everything. If that's true, let me know in the comments. Just write, "I'm with you until the end," so I know you walked this entire path with me. A simple like on this video helps keep these kinds of stories alive, reaching more people who might need them at the exact right moment. And if you'd like to keep exploring narratives that touch on transformation, resilience, and those hidden truths we often forget, subscribing is the easiest way to stay connected. There's also another video right here that continues in the same spirit. Click and join me there, and let's keep walking through these stories together.